This is Chapter 11 of Mark Twain, His Life and Work, a biographical sketch by William M. Clemens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11 As a Businessman, read by John Greenman. 1,000,000 copies of Mark Twain's books have been sold in this country. England and her colonies have taken half as many more, and the larger works have been translated into German, French, Italian, Norwegian, and Danish. Innocents Abroad, Roughing It, The Gilded Age, and A Tramp Abroad were published by the American Publishing Company of Hartford. The Stolen White Elephant appeared from the presses of Osgood of Boston. The humorist has often said that if he were to live his life over again he would publish his own books, and act as his own business manager, thus securing a larger share of the profits arising from the sale of his works. The manuscript of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was completed in March, 1884, but owing to complications and differences with the publishers it did not appear until the following year, although a prospectus of the story was sent out and the opening chapter published in the Century magazine. When the book was completed Mr. Clemens made a proposition in regard to its publication to the American Publishing Company. From the sale of his earlier works this firm had made for itself reputation and wealth. Mark Twain, on his side, received royalties amounting in all to over $400,000. When Huckleberry Finn, the sequel to Tom Sawyer, was completed, he again made them a proposition. Negotiations were commenced but never completed. The parties could not agree upon terms. He was offered liberal royalties, but refused to accept them. The final offer was that the profits should be equally divided, each of the parties to receive 50% of the proceeds from the sale of the new book. This proposition was not satisfactory to the author, who wanted 60% of the profits. The company refused to accept the offer, and Mr. Clemens determined to at once combine the business of publisher with that of author. He had great confidence in the business ability of his nephew, Charles L. Webster of Fredonia, New York. With him he formed a partnership, and Huckleberry Finn appeared bearing the imprint of Charles L. Webster and Company. The result was watched with interest by literary men and publishers all over the world. Huckleberry Finn netted the author a profit of nearly $100,000. Mr. Webster died a few years since, but the firm name remains unchanged. Upon his earlier books Mark received upwards of $30,000 per year for a number of years. Tom Sawyer sold better than any of his books excepting Innocents Abroad. When The Gilded Age was dramatized and placed on the stage by John T. Raymond, it proved a gold mine for the fortunate author. In 1 year Raymond paid Mark over $70,000 in royalties. He never dabbled in Wall Street stocks, although he knew whether Union Pacific or Western Union were up or down, and why. His most unfortunate investment was in the stock of an accident insurance company, where he had invested $50,000, but luckily he saved his money from the wreck. His wife had a large fortune in her own right, but so far as Mark Twain was concerned she might have been penniless, for he insisted that her property be settled upon herself and managed for her interest exclusively. He has made his own fortune in his own way, and has never had to borrow a cent from any one in his business investments since the Innocents began to coin money for him. The firm of Charles L. Webster and Company have published many books in addition to those written by Mark Twain. The profits in the Memoirs of General Grant and those of the Pope were enormous. In 1884, when he read from his own works with George W. Cable, his share of the net profits was $30,000. He invented Mark Twain's scrapbook, which made a fortune for the publishers. Nearly 1,000,000 copies have been sold, and his profits amount to $100,000. He also invented a notebook. All notebooks that he could buy had the vicious habit of opening at the wrong place and distracting attention in that way, so by a simple contrivance he arranged one that always opens at the right place, that is, of course, at the page last written upon. Other simple inventions of Mark Twain's include a vest which enables the wearer to dispense with suspenders, a shirt with collars and cuffs attached which requires neither buttons nor studs, a perpetual calendar watch charm which gives the day of the week and of the month, and a game whereby people may play historical dates and events upon a board, somewhat after the manner of cribbage, being a game whose office is twofold, to furnish the dates and events, and to impress them permanently upon the memory. He is a literary Midas. Everything he has touched has turned to gold, not from luck, but from hard work and with an eye to business. In order to obtain the Grant memoirs for publication, he made terms with the Grant family, which other publishers did not dare to make. As Twain said, they did not appreciate the magnitude of the occasion. After he had become a business man and a millionaire, he was elected an honorary member of the Concord, Massachusetts, Free Trade Club, and in acknowledging the compliment wrote to the secretary as follows: It does look as if Massachusetts were in a fair way to embarrass me with kindnesses this year. In the first place, a Massachusetts judge has just decided in open court that a Boston publisher may sell not only his own property in a free and unfettered way, but also may as freely sell property which does not belong to him, but to me, property which he has not bought and which I have not sold. Under this ruling I am now advertising that judge's homestead for sale, and if I make as good a sum out of it as I expect, I shall go on and sell out the rest of his property. In the next place, a committee of the public library of your town have condemned and excommunicated my last book, and doubled its sale. And finally, the Free Trade Club of Concord comes forward and adds to the splendid burden of obligations already conferred upon me by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts an honorary membership which is worth more than all the rest just at this juncture, since it endorses me as worthy to associate with certain gentlemen whom even the moral icebergs of the Concord Library Committee are bound to respect. May the great Commonwealth of Massachusetts endure forever, is the heartfelt prayer of one who, long a recipient of her mere general good will, is proud to realize that he is at last become her pet. Mr. Clemens has been so busily engaged during the later years of his life that necessarily his book work and his personal correspondence have suffered. He failed to answer a letter written by Sergeant Ballantine, the English author. After waiting a reasonable time, the latter was so exasperated at not receiving an answer that he mailed Mark a sheet of paper and a postage stamp as a gentle reminder. Mr. Clemens wrote back on a postal card, "Paper and stamp received. Please send envelope." Today, in healthful middle age, Samuel L. Clemens is reaping the fruits of a long and varied career. He has been a printer, steamboat pilot, private secretary, miner, reporter, lecturer, inventor, author, publisher, and capitalist. He is one of the few living persons with a truly world-wide reputation. As Miss Gilder has truthfully and wittily remarked, unless the excellent gentlemen engaged in revising the Scriptures should claim the authorship of their work, there is no other living writer whose books are now so widely read as Mark Twain's, and it may not be out of the way to add that In more than one pious household the Innocents Abroad is laid beside the family Bible, and referred to as a handbook of Holy Land description and narrative. End of Chapter 11. Read by John Greenman. This is Chapter 12 of Mark Twain, His Life and Work, a biographical sketch by William M. Clemens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12, Gems from Mark Twain, read by John Greenman. Collected from his published works, Fugitive Sketches, Lectures, Speeches, and Correspondence. Be virtuous, and you will be eccentric. The train is profusely decorated with tunnels. A tortoise-shell cat having a fit in a platter of tomatoes. Figures stew out of me just as natural as the otter of roses out of the otter. There is no bird or cow or anything that uses as good grammar as a blue jay. I wouldn't give a cent to hear Ingersoll on Moses, but I'd give $10 to hear Moses on Ingersoll. One could see the dress creeping along the floor some time after the woman was gone. When the musing spider steps onto the red-hot shovel, he first exhibits wild surprise. Then he shrivels. I left my rheumatism there. Baden-Baden is welcome to it. It was little, but it was all I had to give. I should have liked to leave something more catching, but it was not in my power. I tried him with mild jokes, then with severe ones. I dosed him with bad jokes, and riddled him with good ones. I fired old stale jokes into him, and peppered him fore and aft with red-hot ones. I warmed up to my work, and assaulted him on the right and left, in front and behind. I fumed and charged and ranted till I was sick and frantic and furious. But I never moved him once. I never started a smile or a tear, never a ghost of a smile, and never a suspicion of moisture. He was deaf and dumb and blind as a badger. He was deeply and sincerely pious, and swore like a fishwoman. He was frescoed from head to heel with pictures and mottoes tattooed in red and blue India ink. There was no hackmen, hacks, or omnibuses on the pier. I said it was like being in heaven. Palestine sits in sackcloth and ashes. Over it broods the spell of a curse that has withered its fields and fettered its energies. Formerly, to be a Californian was to be a speculator. A man could not help it. One man tried to be otherwise, but he was only kicking against fate, while everybody was wild with a spirit of speculation and full of plans for making sudden fortunes, he said he would farm along quietly and slowly gain a modest competence and so be happy. But his first crop of onions happened to be about the only onions produced that year. He sold it for $100,000 and retired. A small company, but small companies are pleasantest. He was full of blessed egotism and placid self-importance, but he didn't know as much as a 3M quad. A cat that eat up an entire box of Seidlitz powders and then hadn't any more judgment than to go and take a drink. It is the nature of woman to ask trivial, irrelevant, and pursuing questions, questions that pursue you from a beginning in nothing to a run to cover in nowhere. We walked out into the grass grown, fragment strewn court beyond the Parthenon. It startled us every now and then to see a stony white face stare suddenly up at us out of the grass with its dead. The place seemed alive with ghosts. I half expected to see the Athenian heroes of 20 centuries ago glide out of the shadows and steal into the old temple they knew so well and regarded with such boundless pride. At sea now came the resurrection hour. The berths gave up their dead. These pale spectres in plug hats file up the companionway. Age enlarges and enriches the powers of some musical instruments, notably those of the violin, but it seems to set a piano's teeth on edge. I am a Yankee of the Yankees, a practical man, nearly barren of sentiment or poetry. In other words, my father was a blacksmith, my uncle was a horse doctor, and I was both. He found that the education of the 19th century is plenty good enough capital to go into business in the 6th century with, and the next year he was running the kingdom all by himself on a moderate royalty of 40%. There didn't seem to be brains enough in the entire nursery to bait a fish hook, but you didn't mind that after a little while, for you saw that brains were not needed in a society like that, and would have marred its symmetry and spoiled it. This vile bit of human rubbish. Chambermaids are dead to every human instinct. A forlorn dog, with bowed head and tail withdrawn from service. When a man has been 50 years at sea, he is only a gray and bearded child. He was a man with a hare lip and a pure heart, and everybody said he was true as steel. To the Indian, soap and education are not as sudden as a massacre, but they are more deadly in the long run. They appointed me clerk of the Committee on Conchology, and then allowed me no amanuensis to play billiards with. If there was a horse race, you'd find him flush, or you'd find him busted at the end of it. If there was a dog fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a cat fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a chicken fight, he'd bet on it. Why, if there were two birds sitting on a fence, he would bet you which one would fly first. If I had another cold in the head, and there was no course left me but to take either an earthquake or a quart of warm salt water, I would take my chances on the earthquake. Ah, to think of it, only to think of it, the poor old faithful creature, for she was so faithful. Would you believe it? She had been a servant in that self-same house and that self-same family for 27 years come Christmas, and never a cross word and never a lick. And oh, to think she should meet such a death at last, a sitting over the red-hot stove at 3 o'clock in the morning, and went to sleep and fell on it and was actually roasted, not just frizzled up a bit, but literally roasted to a crisp. Poor faithful creature, how she was cooked! I am but a poor woman, but even if I have to scrimp to do it, I will put up a tombstone over that lone sufferer's grave, and Mr. Riley, if you would have the goodness to think up a little epitaph to put on it, which would sort of describe the awful way in which she met her, put it, "Well done, good and faithful servant," said Riley, and never smiled. The less a man knows, the bigger noise he makes, and the higher salary he commands. Who can join in the heartless libel that says woman is extravagant in dress, when he can look back and call to mind our simple and lowly mother Eve, arrayed in her modification of the Highland costume? He buys the original pig for $1.50 and feeds him $40 worth of corn, and then sells him for about $9. This is the only crop he ever makes any money on. He loses on the corn, but he makes 7.5 on the hog. He stood bewildered a moment, with a sense of goneness on him, like one who finds himself suddenly overboard upon a midnight sea, and beholds the ship pass into shrouding gloom, while the dreadful conviction falls upon his soul that he has not been missed. Just a hunk of brains, that's what he was. He will eat a man, he will eat a Bible, he will eat anything between a man and a Bible. He wrote with impressive flatulence and soaring confidence upon the vastest subjects, but puffing alms gifts of wedding cake, salty ice cream, abnormal watermelons, and sweet potatoes the size of your leg was his best hold. Tom appeared on the sidewalk with a bucket of whitewash and a long-handled brush. He surveyed the fence, and all gladness left him, and a deep melancholy settled down upon his spirit. 30 yards of board fence, 9 feet high. Life to him seemed hollow, and existence but a burden. Sighing, he dipped his brush and passed it along the topmost plank, repeated the operation, did it again, compared the insignificant whitewashed streak with the far-reaching continent of unwhitewashed fence, and sat down on the tree box discouraged. It was just like a new author. They always think that they know more than anybody else when they are getting out their first book. For weeks she nursed her grief in silence, while the roses faded from her cheeks, and through it all she clung to the hope that some day the old love would bloom again in Reginald's heart, and he would write to her. But the long summer days dragged wearily along, and still no letter came. The newspapers teemed with stories of battle and carnage, and eagerly she read them, but always with the same result. The tears welled up and blurred the closing lines. The name she sought was looked for in vain, and the dull aching returned to her sinking heart. Letters to the other girls sometimes contained brief mention of him, and presented always the picture of him, a morose, unsmiling, desperate man, always in the thickest of the fight, begrimed with powder, and moving calm and unscathed through tempests of shot and shell, as if he bore a charmed life. A cross between a tired mud turtle and a crippled hearse horse. He means well, but art is folly to him. He only understands groceries. His strawberries would be a comfortable success if the robins would eat turnips, but they won't, and hence the difficulty. Having forgotten to mention it sooner, I will remark, in conclusion, that the ages of the Siamese twins are respectively 51 and 53 years. I found the brave fellow in a profound French calm. I say French calm because French calmness and English calmness have points of difference. He was moving swiftly back and forth among the debris of his furniture, now and then staving chance fragments of it across the room with his foot, grinding a constant grist of curses through his set teeth, and halting every little while to deposit another handful of his hair on the pile which he had been building of it on the table. The place is as dark as the inside of an infidel. She was a perfect polyglot once, but somehow her palate got down. And so saying, he turned his face to the wall and gave up the ghost. We write frankly and fearlessly, but then we modify before we print. Oh, I know him, a sallow-faced, red-headed fellow, with a little scar on the side of his throat, like a splinter under the flesh. A woman who could face the devil himself, or a mouse, loses her grip and goes all to pieces in front of a flash of lightning. He was a man of middle size and compact frame, and when he was thinking deeply he had a way of knitting his brows and tapping his forehead reflectively with his finger, which impressed you at once with the conviction that you stood in the presence of a person of no common order. The poem is smooth and blubbery. It reads like buttermilk gurgling from a jug. A sincere compliment is always grateful to a young lady, so long as you don't try to knock her down with it. Cain is branded a murderer so heartlessly and unanimously in America only because he was neither a Democrat nor a Republican. A long, cadaverous creature, with lanky locks hanging down to his shoulders, and a week's stubble bristling from the hills and valleys of his face. Epitaphs are cheap, and they do a poor chap a world of good after he is dead, especially if he had hard luck while he was alive. I wish they were used more. I do not know how it came about exactly, but gradually we appeared to melt down and run together, conversationally speaking, and then everything went along as comfortably as clockwork. Your conscience is a nuisance. A conscience is like a child. If you pet it and play with it and let it have everything it wants, it becomes spoiled and intrudes on all of your amusements and most of your griefs. Treat your conscience as you would treat anything else. When it is rebellious, spank it. Be severe with it. Argue with it. Prevent it from coming to play with you at all hours, and you will secure a good conscience, that is to say, a properly trained one. A spoiled conscience simply destroys all the pleasure in life. I think I have reduced mine to order. At least I haven't heard from it for some time. Perhaps I've killed it through over severity. It's wrong to kill a child, but in spite of all I have said, a conscience differs from a child in many ways. Perhaps it is best when it is dead. End of Chapter 12, and end of Mark Twain, His Life and Work, a biographical sketch by William M. Clemens, read by John Greenman.